Why creative people can't and don't get things done. A creative, introspective person with many ideas who doesn't get things done and doesn't turn their ideas into reality because they feel constantly overwhelmed by the modern age and they hate this hustle and grind culture. Are you familiar with this type of person? Are you maybe this type of person? I gave this detailed description because I've been working with creative people for years. And my writing has been attracting creative people for years, so I receive dozens of messages per day from creative people describing their experience to me. And the unfortunate truth is that the vast majority of creative people just don't get things done in their lives. So we are going to talk about why that's the case. And let me get straight to the point. Most creative people, most creative introspective people have underused and underdeveloped wills. When I say will, most of you would better understand if I said willpower, but that's precisely the mistake that we are going to address. So, maybe some of you thought that I'm going to say you are too profound for this modern age, you are too profound for this age of distraction and so many temptations, and this superficial age that doesn't reward the deeply, deeply creative person. And maybe some of that is true. Maybe we don't live in the best age ever for deeply creative people. Maybe we live in an age that is more adjusted to an opportunistically inclined person with a dash of creativity. But that's besides the point. We are not here, hopefully you're not here on this channel watching my videos to receive pity. Let's make some real world change. So let's address the things that you can change about yourself to better engage in this world, no matter how unjust it is, no matter how ill-suited it is for a person like you. So let's acknowledge maybe there are certain, or maybe there's a lot of things, not certain aspects, maybe there are a lot of things to criticize about this age that we are living in and the state of society, but now we want to address something that you can change, something that I have changed about myself, so that I'm in this position where I can create educational materials and have people that actually want to listen to me. So, the vast majority of creative people have underused and underdeveloped will. And as I said, it would be more relatable if I said willpower, but that's where the mistake lies. Why do most creative people have underused and underdeveloped will? Because they feel resistance toward using and developing and training their will. Well, why do they have this resistance? Because a wrong perspective on what the will is and what the use of will is in one's psychological life and in one's engagement with the external world. Now, this is not a philosophical debate around the concept of free will. We have to put that aside. We have to recognize will as an internal resource that is used in the creation of your life, in whatever you do. Now, at the core of that inner resource, is it free or not? Determinism, so on and so forth. We are not going to engage in those philosophical debates, at least not now and not here. So, what is this wrong perspective, wrong view, mistaken view on the will and its role in your life? Well, there is this thing called the Victorian will or Victorian willpower. A lot of psychologists of the 20th century, Carl Jung, Rollo May, Roberto Assagioli, Abraham Maslow, they all at least somewhere mentioned the Victorian willpower. What is it? It is this mistaken, outdated, very time period specific idea of the human will and how it's being used and what it's being used for. So I'm going to quote Roberto Assagioli from the book The Act of Will. He says, "The Victorian conception of the will still prevails." So he's writing this in the 70s, and we can say that this is true even today in 2025. The Victorian conception of the will still prevails, a conception of something stern and forbidding, which condemns and represses most of other aspects of human nature. But such a misconception might be called a caricature of the will. It is such misuse that has brought the will into disrepute, producing a violent reaction against it which has swung to the other extreme, a tendency to refuse any kind of control and discipline of drives, urges, wishes, whims, a cult of unbridled spontaneity. Now, let's put this into some context or maybe give additional explanation. The idea of the Victorian will, the idea of Victorian willpower is one of the reasons why Freud's work was so necessary and why it was so wide and it ended up being so popular, because in the Victorian age this use of will to self-oppress, to suppress and repress, to be a tyrant to yourself. It is well known that in Victorian age there was it was part of the culture to suppress one's drives and urges, to appear always in a somewhat formal, extremely well-controlled state, to always appear to be in control of oneself. So when the whole culture is so intent on being in control of oneself, not in a healthy way, but again in a self-oppressive way, that's what creates the idea that the human will or willpower is a self-oppressive force. And that idea has persisted. It hasn't been challenged enough. And then in the 70s, you have the rebellion, where there is zero suppression, zero repression, and zero control and zero containment. You have a lot of movements in the West that are, again, an overcorrection from the Victorian will and basically stating, or sometimes explicitly, sometimes through a lifestyle stating, I don't want to use my willpower. I want all of my drives and urges to just carry me. It's kind of this bastardized version of the Eastern tradition view of being in flow with the nature, being in flow with the universe, being in alignment with nature and not resisting. Let's just be clear. The Eastern idea of not resisting the universe, not resisting the flow of nature, has nothing to do with the Western movement or movements of the second half of the 20th century that proclaim, I'm going to be free-spirited and I'm going to use zero self-control in my life. Those two have nothing to do with each other. It's just that the Western movement kind of, again, bastardized and abused the Eastern tradition's ideas. Why is this important? Well, as Assagioli says, there is this tendency to refuse any kind of control and discipline of drives, urges, wishes, whims, a cult of unbridled spontaneity. So these are important historical and cultural shifts that have influenced how we today are looking at human will as a resource that we can and should be using to direct our own lives. And if in the Victorian age it was the teacher, the parent, and the person in power who gave a bad reputation to the will by influencing us and teaching us and asking us to self-oppress, today we have a different flavor of the person who gives a bad reputation to human will. We have the Andrew Tates of the world, we have Wes Watsons of the world, we have these clowns, these scammers or scam artists that are cosplaying as high performers, cosplaying as tough men, cosplaying as successful people, and they are telling you that anything that you want to achieve in life, you achieve by just pushing through, not caring about your feelings, not caring about any other aspect of yourself other than what the immediate goal is. Those are the people that tell you to, suck it up and just do the thing, and no one cares how you feel, and no one cares what who you are as a more nuanced personality. It's what your immediate external goal is, push through it and reach that goal. Those are the people who in this day and age are giving bad reputation to the resource, the beautiful resource of the human will. Just like 100 years ago, it was the teachers and the overly strict parents and people in position of power. So, again, we just have a different flavor of people who are giving bad reputation to human will. Although I would agree, as unhealthy as the original Victorian conception of the willpower was, I would say that at least the teachers, parents and people in power 100 years ago had a bit more style and class than the people today who are giving bad reputation to willpower, or human will, but that's besides the point. Again, this interchanging use of terms will and willpower. Willpower exists, willpower is something relevant, but it's better to use the term will because it's broader and it gives justice to what will is as a resource. Because it's not just about power, it's not just about pushing through. That is an aspect of it, but it's not the entirety of what the will is and what the will is for. Because now we have this violent reaction against the will, we end up with two opposite extremes in terms of how we approach and how we view the will. Again, I'm quoting Roberto Assagioli from The Act of Will. He says, one of these extremes is the traditional attempt to force these functions, human functions, into operation by sheer power and direct imposition. The other mistake, which is prevalent today, he says, and I agree, again, from the experience of working with creative, introspective people, the other mistake is to abdicate the will. Urges, drives, and desires are allowed to happen without any regulation or consistent direction. In such a situation, the function that is the strongest at the moment will capture one's attention and express itself. So pay attention, no pun intended. In such a situation, the function that is the strongest, so the urge or drive that is the strongest, the motivation that is the strongest, will capture one's attention and express itself. Think of all the urges that have been ruling your life. Capture one's attention, express itself, and in doing so will inhibit or repress all other functions that are less powerful at the moment. This produces inner conflict and stress, reduced effectiveness through dispersal of energy, and potentially harmful reactions within oneself and between oneself and others. Let's just repeat this. Reduced effectiveness through dispersal of energies. This is why you are not getting things done. Because of thinking that will is something that self-oppresses, because of thinking that to use your will or willpower means to shrink yourself into another Andrew Tate minion, because of that, you have been denying yourself from the gift of using your will in a more nuanced way. And then what happens? The reduced effectiveness through dispersal of energies. What does that mean? It means that your urges, drives, whims and wishes are guiding you or ruling you in a way where you have no control over your attention and your energy. Two of your most prized and most precious resources, especially in the modern age, you have no control over them. You have no control over the management of the flow of your attention and energy. So that's the question for the creative person. Why you're not getting things done? It's not because you're too profound for this superficial age. It's you need to stand in front of the mirror, maybe quite literally, and ask yourself, do I have adequate control over the flow of my energy and attention? Am I participating in the management of my psychophysical resources? Or am I a slave to my urges? Let's look at what is the more balanced view of the will. And now I'm going to risk appearing less cool than I would like to be, and I'm going to continue reading from my piece of writing. So this is now going to be a bit of quoting and a bit of freestyling on the writing of the recovering overthinker, and that is me. The more balanced conception of the will is that the will is not a tyrant, but a helmsman, the person who steers the ship. The Victorian conception of the will imagines your, let's say, your existence, your being, your life as a ship. And the will is a captain or an officer that stands on the ship's deck with a whip and is whipping the slaves who are rowing the ship. A terrifying image. So the creative, introspective, profound person wants to rebel and does rebel against the will, against that idea of the will, and pushes the captain or the officer off the ship. And what you're left with is the ship without the commander that is being carried by the waves. What does that translate to in real life? No sense of personal agency, no participation in determining the direction and the quality of your life. Just, again, the bastardized idea of going with the flow without you having any control over your life. But it doesn't have to be that way. The will is not a tyrant. Again, the will is a helmsman. The function of the will is not to oppress and force. Its function is to balance and constructively utilize psychophysical energies of the human being without repressing them. Now, all of this is not to say that, again, there is no willpower. This is not to say that the will doesn't have this function of powering through, pushing through. We all love the stories of humans who faced certain challenges that felt or seemed unsurmountable, and they pushed through them by the sheer power of that power of willpower, not the best phrasing, but the sheer power of the human will. And I love we all love the concept of the human unbreakable spirit, right? So, yes, the human will does have that role, but that's not its entirety. Instead of the angry officer with a whip, the will is like a skillful helmsman. The helmsman knows where the ship is headed, and it keeps it on course despite the changes in the wind and the current. However, he or she doesn't do this by brute force. The strength with which the helmsman turns the wheel of the ship is not what determines his ability to keep the ship on the course. It's his understanding of both the sea and the ship that matters. It's his ability to use the power of both the sea and the ship to aid in the movement instead of pitting against each other the sea and the ship. Because again, this is not about always brute forcing things. It's not about pitting the ship against the sea. It's about using all of the available energies, all of the available resources in harmony. And I want to give you an example of a more skillful use of the will. It's this exact video. And the video that I made yesterday, and the video that I made the day before yesterday, and the video that I made the day before yesterday, and so on and so forth. What do I mean by this? I have one option, and that is to brute force my way into recording these videos. Because believe it or not, there is a lot of resistance. I'm one of those creative, introspective people who a couple of years ago wasn't getting much done in his life. I'm still the creative, introspective person who feels a ton of resistance. So what do I do? Should I brute force my way? Or should I maybe completely throw my hands up and say I give up? I give up. There is no point. I hate the idea of brute forcing things. I hate this hustle and grind culture, so I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to wait for the moment when the inspiration strikes, and then somehow I'm going to create a masterpiece. You know, I'm going to be in the flow with the universe, and I'm never going to try really in life. I'm never going to try, I'm never going to sweat. I'm never going to put in the hours of work because that's what superficial people do. No, I'm not going to do that either. So where is, again, the middle way is the balanced, skillful use of the will. What is an example of that? An example of that is before me making this video, where there is such great resistance. There is insecurity, perfectionism, imposter syndrome. There is always thinking there is more to be done. There is so many different, sometimes there is laziness. For example, there was no laziness today, but sometimes there is laziness. So it's not about forcing through, pushing through, and using the will or the willpower as a tyrant that is whipping me. It's about skillful use. So what are other psychological functions that I can use? What are other psychophysical resources that I can use to bring myself into harmony and then create this video? Where? Well, I can remind myself of the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing in life, why I'm creating educational material. I can remind myself of the specific goal of this video that I want to create. Then I can affirm my decision. I can take a minute to affirm with myself and make a clear statement and make my intention clear with myself that I'm going to do my best in trying to create this video and not in trying to control the outcome. What else can I do? I can do a couple of minutes of breathing to calm myself down. What else can I do? I can do some speaking exercises, which maybe I could use more of. What else can I do? I can use the psychological law of images creating or producing adequate emotions or actions, which I talked about in one of my recent videos. So I can turn around and spend a couple of minutes looking at my poster that reminds me to slow down, breathe, focus, and flow. So all of these things still require my will, because again, will is what directs the use of our resources, not necessarily what forces the use of our resources. So the skillful use of the will is me doing all of these things so that there is a lesser resistance. Maybe I will not arrive at zero resistance in creating the video or in writing an essay, but I will greatly reduce the resistance by skillfully using the will. This is, my friends, why most creative people don't get things done, because unfortunately they are in some way, or you are in some way, a victim of the wrong idea of what will is. That is the Victorian idea of the willpower. But then you also made a mistake in making an overcorrection and trying to completely abandon the use of will or willpower. So hopefully this provided a more balanced perspective, a more nuanced perspective. And now the question is, are you going to accept the project of learning to use your will more skillfully? If yes, drop a comment, because this is just scratching the surface of this whole topic of a more human, more balanced, more skillful use of the will. And I would love to talk more about it, but I need to hear from you. Are you ready to engage in this project? Thank you.